All right, this is the Legislative Committee meeting on Monday, July 15th, 2024 at 6 p.m. I will call the meeting to order and ask for a roll call. Mr. Bailey.
Present.
Ms. Shirley Sarian.
Present.
Alderperson Drzwicki is present. We also have Chris, our city attorney.
I'm present.
And Gina, our city planner.
Also present.
All right, election of a chairperson.
I will nominate Andrew Drzwicki as the chair.
Can I say?
Second. I'm sorry.
I know. Last I checked, I
thought
can't second my, just in
Well,
case. I know, apparently I can. All right.
Yeah,
So
whatever. Okay.
if no other nominations, I will call for an all in favor. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries unanimously. Election of a vice chairperson. I will nominate Mr. Bruce Bailey.
Second.
Any other nominations? All right, then I will call for an all in favor. All in favor of Mr. Bailey? Aye.
Aye.
All right. Motion carries. Chairperson is Alderperson Drzwicki. Vice chairperson is Alderperson Bailey.
Finally.
It's official.
All right. Approval of the May 22nd, 2024 meeting minutes. I did not see anything that needs to be adjusted.
I'll make a motion to approve.
Second.
All in favor of the meeting minutes?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries unanimously. Number 5, discussion and recommendations for finalizing revisions to the lighting ordinance for permanent accent lighting on residential homes. Chris.
Okay, so I sent around to you guys, I hope you get a chance to review over the weekend an ordinance. I wasn't able to find anything. The way we generally work is we usually try to find a few different templates and pull them together and send them over, and you guys can kind of pick and choose from the different portions that you think is appropriate. I wasn't able to find too many ordinances that deal with this issue specifically, and I'm not sure what to make of that, frankly. So what I did pull was the Middleton Lighting Code, which is really, really thorough. I mean, it's probably way beyond what you guys were hoping to do. And you guys do already have certain lighting restrictions, more so on the commercial side and the zoning district in terms of downlighting and whatnot for commercial properties, businesses, that type of thing. But my understanding from last meeting is that you guys are really focusing more on residential accent lighting type concerns. Mm-hmm. So I tried to pull out the provisions from this code and then modify them based on what I understood the concerns to be from the last meeting to come up with something that could maybe work for Greenfield. So that's kind of what the draft is here. One of the questions I flagged, I think, in my email is one of the concepts that I kind of like, and I'm just not sure how workable it is from a technical standpoint, is the idea that we would set a brightness standard essentially at the property line and saying that any sort of accent lighting can't be brighter than X lumens or X candle feet or whatever the appropriate standard would be. So there's two questions there. One is figuring out what that number is appropriate, or maybe we just say it's got to go off at a certain time. That's an option as well. But then to the extent we put a number on it, does ultimately the police department or the code enforcement person have the actual equipment to be able to go out and measure that to determine whether or not it's in excess of that number or not? And I don't know the answer to that. So depending on what you guys want to do for the standard, that's something we may have to look at. Now, if we were to instead just go with a more simple approach saying that all accent lighting has to be turned off at 10 p.m., 9 p.m., at midnight, whatever number you guys ultimately pick, there may still be enforcement issues to the extent people disagree about what accent lighting is and whether it's applicable or not. There's always those issues to work through. But that from a cleanliness of enforcement standpoint, it's a little easier. You just look at is the light on? Is it that time? Gotta shut it off, and if it's not, it's a violation.
Right. For the time being, the home in question has agreed to having those lights off from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. right now and has continued to do so at my request generously. So whether or not we could just adopt that universally generally for the time being and try to get that on the agenda for the next.
What type of lighting do they actually have?
So I don't want to call it Christmas lights, but the lights that they've put up look as though they are Christmas lights. So if you've ever seen a hotel with the bright lighting along the eaves and hatches along the roof line,
that
lighting doesn't get taken down. Once it's installed, it stays. So it's, It's permanent lighting on the house. It's not considered holiday or temporary lighting, but it can be lit up as though it was lit for a holiday
Is
or
it like
something else.
the icicles that you see periodically that they hang down, or is it more of a light strip? More like a,
It looks like a string of Christmas lights with large bulbs, but they're
Okay.
permanently installed. You don't just go up there and take them down,
okay.
generally. So the best.
But what's to say that then they're not holiday lights?
I know.
That's the-
This-
Yeah, and that's one of the issues I tried to address in here, although
Yeah.
Right.
it's,
Unless we would do it by month, November and December is excluded from this ordinance or something like that. But I did drive past this house,
Oh.
and it's something. It's a straight line and then goes around the guy, and it's, you can change the colors. But
Correct.
when I was there, it was green, and,
Yep.
I mean, you could stand in it. I got out of the car and stood in the middle of the street. Luckily, it's not on a busy street, it's on a subdivision, or towards the end there. And you could probably read
Okay.
a book or something.
and is it all in the front of the house, or is it wrapped
Yeah,
around the
just,
sides?
well, it's just in front of the house that I could see. It goes around and then around the peak and then down and
Okay,
around the garage.
For this particular homeowner, it's just facing the street. Their installation of this type of lighting, it's along their front eave, along the roof line.
okay. Okay, have you, ultimately, it's a policy call for the common council, I suppose, but have you received a lot of complaints from anybody, or is it just from a single property owner? It's one of the issues that always comes into play with these things, and it's something that I communicate, and people never want to hear it when they have a problem, but it's difficult and maybe not even advisable for local governments to try to solve every neighbor problem.
Right.
So if there's a situation that's really just one neighbor that doesn't like something that another neighbor is doing,
Correct.
once you start trying to legislate against that, it ends up being overbroad, you end up prohibiting things that most people don't have a problem with.
Right, inherently, and I think that's why, at least for myself, I'm more concerned just with the hours of operation, if you will, more so than say, you can't do X, Y, Z, because then it becomes complicated. And it's not that I'm not trying to resolve it for potential animosity between multiple homeowners on that street. We're trying to be as reasonable as possible, saying that we would like people to get a good night's rest, and
Sure.
maybe you shouldn't have to stare at a green light from
Yeah.
10 PM to 8 AM.
Yeah,
For now. Should we need to do something further with luminosity or others, that will take additional time, in my opinion, but for right now, at the bare minimum. And if we do need to say, well, during true Christmas holiday, you know, what's gonna define a holiday? Right now, I just say, for those hours during the year, just please keep them off.
I mean, we could say that you're not gonna, do you want to apply to Christmas lights as well during, or, I mean, if not, we could just say that all exterior lights are supposed to be turned off at 8.
I think
10,
that's,
6, I
yeah, I
suppose.
know, I think that's gonna cause other
That's
complications.
probably more of an issue.
If we're really gonna call it out, we gotta appropriately define what is permanent accent lighting, and that home is the best example for the moment.
So right at the beginning of this ordinance, the draft, you have the common council has recently received several complaints from multiple residents regarding the brightness of neighboring permanent accent lighting. So we're just talking about this one house.
I thought, Bruce, didn't you also, I thought you
Oh.
also had a,
Oh, no, I was talking about Andrew's.
I thought, didn't you also receive a complaint from somebody at some point about somebody in your district, or?
I had one also,
Okay.
but that was more of a, like a big.
This was the
flood-
difference
that was
between
floodlight.
floodlights
And
versus.
they don't
this.
want to turn it off. It
Okay.
keeps on, it's for security purposes, and we did the whole
yeah.
lumen thing and everything, and the guy's not in violation.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's what, I mean, I had that problem too, with the security light.
Right.
A neighbor complained, but it was okay.
Right. So it's ultimately what the committee wants to recommend to the common council and what the common council may or may not pass. I mean,
Right.
I'm not sure, I don't know where the rest of the council is on this. They may say, you know what, it's too local of an issue and we don't want to go there. That's possible too. But I think all we can do is make the ordinance reflect what the committee, what the committee thinks it should say, and then send it up to the council, and then it goes where it goes. So, I mean, so the definition that we have now for permanent access lighting is lighting that's attached or affixed to a structure or to landscaping, which is intended to remain in place indefinitely, which operates all or most of the night. We have to modify that, I forget what the sound was, but.
Yep.
And which is used primarily to enhance the building's appearance or to enhance landscape through the illumination of the structure or trees,
Yep.
bushes, plants, flagpoles, and monuments. Then we say that it does not include holiday lighting and security lighting, so those are, unfortunately, those issues are still out there. But if it falls within that definition, I mean, we do have the foot candle standard, which we wouldn't have to go with at this point, we could just go with an hour restriction. Permanent access lighting shall not be permitted to be located within a side yard or other setback. It doesn't sound like that's the case here. Because it's right on the house, I think, right? It's physically attached.
I mean, it's at the setback that we would normally define for a home back from the street to
Okay.
begin with. So it's
Okay.
at the same distance. But in this case, it is.
Did you say that it cannot be located within 10 feet of a neighboring residence? This may or may not.
And I have a question about that. I wasn't sure what that meant.
Well,
The light itself or the,
That's kind of what I was contemplating, was that the light itself, you would take
okay,
the nearest point of the light and the nearest residence and measure it, and just keep it simple. And if
Yeah.
it's, now your side yard's gonna be, depending on the neighborhood, I suppose, at least 5 feet, I would think historically. You may have some smaller lots that have smaller side yards than that, but 5 feet's pretty small.
Yeah.
So if you have theoretically a 5-foot side yard on each house, that should be 10 feet right there.
Yep.
Now, I suppose if the lights are bright enough, maybe a 10-foot setback isn't enough. But the other issue that maybe the way we could, so maybe that does or doesn't stay in, but I think the next section potentially is more helpful here. Permanent access lighting may not utilize strobe lights, laser lights, neon lights, searchlights or beacons, rapidly changing or pulsating colors, lighting that could be construed or confused with traffic lights, rope lights on lighting structures, so that's getting closer to what we're looking at. Lighting determined by the city police department to contribute to disabling or distracting glare, or lighting intended to illuminate property other than that. So if you can't shine your lights on your neighbors intentionally.
Yep.
So I don't know if that language would pick up what's out there, or do we need to modify that to more clearly address what the,
No, I think that would be fine for right now, and inherently, that particular homeowner has been instructed to make certain that it's not directly pointing at someone else's property, for that matter, floodlights or else, which they've done already,
okay.
to the best of my ability.
So you've approached the property owner just personally and said, we mind shutting it off between 10 and?
We've spoken via email on a number of occasions now, so, but yes, inherently, he's okay with the hours restriction, and the majority of that last bit there should capture anything else that may or
Okay.
may not define truly what is attached to his house, but that's as best as we can probably do for the time being.
Okay, and you talked about between 10 and 6, was it?
10 p.m. and 8 a.m., he's had the lights off.
Okay. And has he indicated
He has no issues with this for the time being.
will he do that indefinitely, or, I mean, I guess the question is, do we need the ordinance to, or is he just gonna, you're afraid at some point it's gonna come back?
Yeah.
Yeah,
As much as I would rather not, just for the time being, so that we have something in place saying that here are the restrictions and for the hours of
so why
operation.
does he have the decorative lights on during the day? I mean,
For fun.
you could just say between 10 p.m. and sunup, I suppose, or presumably they're not a problem during the day, or are they?
It seems that if they get turned on before 8 a.m., they're upsetting a few neighbors with having bright lights that are getting through their window, depending on whether or not it rained the previous night and the lights are reflecting off the street and causing issues.
so does he turn them on in the morning?
No.
Does he, or,
I've had. Okay. It's been suggested to me that they were potentially on, but before 8 a.m., and that has been cause for concern. But as far as I know now,
I'm
it
in a
keeps them
meeting.
off from 10
Is it
p.m. to 8
important?
a.m., and it hasn't caused any complications
Bye.
since.
Okay.
And after 8 o'clock, usually the sun's up. We don't typically have issues with lighting.
The ordinance could read from 10 p.m. until sunup the following day, and then it's seasonally adjusting depending on,
Yeah, I mean, if that's not going to overcomplicate you writing the legislation bit, I'd be okay with
I think
that.
we could do that, I think we could do that. So if I'm hearing correctly, it sounds like you're okay with, you think the definition picks up what we're looking at. Holiday lighting is carved out, security lighting is carved out, and then we would just do a blanket. such accident lighting, we'll just do the time limit on it, we won't worry about the location stuff.
Yep.
But keep the prohibitions on the specific types of permanent accidents, so there's strobe lights, your neon lights, your.
I don't mean to be
Go
a
ahead.
problem,
No, it's good. This is the-
but I'm just questioning, why would a person turn these lights on during the day? It just doesn't make sense.
I mean, depending on how bright they are, you wouldn't think they'd even be visible, right?
I guess.
Like I said, it's for
What's the
fun. If-
purpose?
It's for fun if they
Oh,
so
for
so
fun.
wish. Like they could, every other light, they can go red, would have lit up the house for July 4th as an example. They have the ability to control all that. Technically, it can probably strobe and do some of the other
Right,
things
right,
that we're
some of those-
talking there.
those
So
things as well.
inherently, that can be
All right,
picked up.
whatever.
So, do I want to make a big deal out of it? No, but
Right,
we kind of should do something here.
but we haven't had complaints about any of the daytime issues, it's only between.
Not since we
But-
made that, not since I had that discussion with the homeowner and else, I haven't had any official complaints from anyone.
Okay.
So the people who are complaining, the neighbors,
They have
They're
not
o-
complained since, no. So, before I asked him
Right.
to kindly change the hours out of kindness
Right.
rather than,
and they don't care if he has the lights on during the day.
no,
Well,
as far as I can tell,
it sounds like this is not lighting of a flag, right? I mean, this is just
No.
decorative on the house.
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, it said something about a flag, what was that?
It talks about illumination of a flag pole, and I think it's really contemplating something different, but you're right, we should probably just remove that altogether. Because that does get a little bit complicated, there are some standards that talk, if you have a flag flying at night, it's gotta be lit.
Yep.
So I think we'll have to,
I just put that out.
that's a good point, I think we'll have to pull that part out.
Yeah, I don't know why, when I drove past, in fact, it was probably around 11 o'clock at night, why that homeowner would want his lights, his house lit up like that all night. He just feels it's nice looking and,
I'm sure that's what it is, I'm sure it's an aesthetic thing, and I'm sure some people probably is quite nice looking. But if it's, and I guess that's the other thing I should throw on the table here, I mean, if it's, where I'm proposing to put this verbiage is actually in the, kind of the public nuisance section of your code, because that sounds like that's really what the concern is here. It's impacting a neighborhood.
Yep.
But to the extent it's really only impacting one property owner, and we don't know that, right? Because some people, just because only one person has complained, that doesn't mean that the other people aren't bothered by it, that they don't want to be the person to come forward
Yep.
and whatnot.
Yep.
So sometimes the person who does complain actually represents a larger group than maybe is really comfortable, you don't want to cause tension with the neighbors or
Yep.
whatever. But if ultimately the common council were to choose to not change the code to adopt this, there is still a concept of a private nuisance. So a public nuisance is when somebody does something that interferes with either a public street or public sidewalk or a large enough area that it essentially is an inherently public problem. But even if somebody is doing something that really only impacts one property, there's still a private nuisance cause of action that they could bring, so they could hire a lawyer and they could go after them on their own. If they're really unable to enjoy their property now because these lights are on all the time. So that's another remedy potentially, they're not gonna wanna hear that, because they're gonna get their own lawyer and whatnot.
Right.
But I'm just throwing it out there to the extent ultimately the common council were to say that we're just not gonna go there at this point. It's an option for them anyhow. Now, it sounds like in the short term, the property owner's agreeing to be cooperative
Yep.
and that's what's frustrating because did they talk beforehand or no, do you know?
I'm not entirely sure if complaintee and complainant
Aren't speaking
talk to
terms?
one, yeah. Or I should say complainants and.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, because ideally that
Of the
would be the way
complaintee.
this would
Yes,
shake out, right?
inherently, I would rather it be that way, but it would seem that we need to
Yeah,
do a little extra here. So aside from what
So you were the one who talked with them, or?
I have attempted to, along with our code enforcement, to
Oh,
do that
code
directly,
enforcement
yes.
also.
Keith started this, and then I
Okay.
tried
But
to
it's,
put it.
but it seems like you've solved the problem.
For now,
Why do you think it's for now? Just because that's,
the complainants want to see official legislation from the city that,
Oh.
that time restriction at minimum is in place,
I see.
aside from anything else. So I'm doing my best as representative of the district to try and resolve that.
understood.
Followed? Okay. So what I would like is a motion to put forth to the Common Council our recommendations regarding permanent accent lighting for a time restriction amongst the other edits that Chris just spoke about for our next special Common Council meeting or the next Common Council meeting at which we can add it to.
And just so I'm clear, did you want to go with the 8 a.m.
The 10 p.m. to
or 10 p.m. till sunrise?
10 p.m. till sunrise.
Okay.
Yeah. Including what I just said. Could I have a motion for that, please?
I'll make a motion to that effect, if you draft something as discussed,
Yep.
Well,
take it to the
well-
common council.
I mean, he has it's already drafted, right?
Yeah,
I mean, that's
I think
it.
what if I understand correctly, it sounds like I'll remove some of the other restrictions.
Yeah,
Just keep it very simple.
Right.
Just to keep the definitions, pull out the reference to the flagpole because we have to address that issue. Add in, keep the holiday lighting definition, the security lighting definition. We won't even need foot candle at that point, or any of those other issues. Put the time limit in, so 10 p.m. to sunrise, and then keep in the blanket prohibitions on laser lighting and neon lighting and whatnot.
Yep.
And then hopefully that'll work, and hopefully that will solve the problem, and if it doesn't, then we can always revisit it.
Yep. All else, then I have a motion from Alderperson Bailey. Do I have a second?
I'll let you second
And
it.
then I will second. All in favor? Aye. Motion carries.
Okay, so I'll make that change then, and then if, maybe whenever your next meeting, there's a special meeting coming up?
Charlotte, you remember?
I'm sorry, what?
You remember? I didn't bring my planner with me. Is there a special meeting at the beginning of August?
There is a special meeting, but
I thought it was
I'm-
the first, in
Well, put it this
September.
way, I'll make the changes and I'll get over to Jennifer, and then whenever you guys have your meeting.
I have it on my home calendar, or we can
Whenever the
look
next
at
one
it.
is.
Okay,
Oh, not-
yeah.
All right, discussion and recommendations for finalizing the Airbnb and VRBO regulations for short-term rentals.
Okay,
So
I
an
sent over,
update, yes.
an updated version of, this really tracks the ordinance for the town of Holland up in Sheboygan County, which was recently sued, and they went through at least circuit court, and they wanted the circuit court level, and it doesn't appear that there was appeal beyond that. So this should be a pretty state-of-the-art regulation of where short-term licensing lies. The reason this came up is because the state legislature changed the law a couple of years ago that basically says that municipalities can no longer ban short-term rentals outright, at least for periods between 7 days and 29 days, essentially. You can still ban them for periods shorter than 7 days, which this draft will currently do. So in other words, people can't just rent a house for the weekend. It's got to at least be a week-long rental. And then there's other restrictions that you can put in place, such as saying the property can't be rented for more than 180 days over the course of the year. So you're trying to make sure that it actually is still owner-occupied in that sense. And you can also require that that the rental period has to run consecutive, so they can't do a month here, a month there.
Yep.
Once the clock starts, the 180-day clock starts running. You don't have to do that, but the law does allow the municipalities to impose that restriction if you guys are so inclined. Otherwise, basically what you're doing is you're setting up a licensing scheme that requires them to come in and pull a permit, so you know who they are, you know what they're doing. They've got to keep a guest registry. There's minimum standards in terms of how many people can be in the building. It's generally covered by the building code now anyhow, in terms of how many people can be in a structure. There's just dealing with off-street parking to a certain extent, where it would be allowed, where it wouldn't be. It requires, unless the property owner is going to be within a certain vicinity the whole time, that they actually have to appoint a property manager to be available during, again, normal business hours in case a problem arises. You know, the renters are being really obnoxious, the neighbors are complaining. You want to be able to get some, or maybe there's a problem with the structure itself, there's a water leak, somebody has to be available to respond if there's an issue that comes up, and that person has to be, the identity of that person has to be given to the city so that you guys know who to contact if the need arises. So it puts in place that structure. Some of these, not all of these provisions would have to be in there. It could be much more scaled back if you guys chose to go that way. But this seems like it's a pretty, again, based on the Holland ordinance, it seems like this is a comprehensive sense of where we're at and what can be done. Doesn't mean it won't be challenged, but it should stand up at the end of the day.
So was this what is called an Airbnb?
Yep.
This, okay, so it's, okay.
Yeah, this is your Airbnb, is your vacation rental by owner. It's a short-term rental, so it's anything shorter than a month essentially. So most rentals are gonna be month to month or a year long, that type of a thing. But what Airbnb and VRBO made possible was the shorter term rentals so that you can list your property on your own. One thing I did wanna flag, I guess, and get some feedback from the committee on, was that the Holland ordinance, which I thought was a little interesting, actually says that it applies to those who rent the property out more than 10 days over the course of the year. So it almost like builds in a trial period where people can try it for up to 10 days, and if they like it, then they would go through the licensing procedure. If they say it wasn't for me, then they don't have to do it, and they don't have to get the license. It struck me as kind of a weird thing. Normally, you would say that if you want to do this, you've got to get a license in advance. But they chose to put that in their ordinance, and so I left it in there for discussion purposes, but I don't know if that's something that you guys would be in favor of or not.
I suppose that isn't a terrible idea. Do you guys understand what Chris is talking about?
Yeah,
More or less, we're saying,
In section 3B, it says that no person may maintain, manage, or operate a short-term rental more than 10 nights without obtaining a short-term rental license. So it builds in this little window. It struck me as kind of an odd thing, but,
Yeah, and how many times can they do that?
well,
They-
theoretically, it says 10
And
times.
yeah,
oh,
So
10 oh, it does say
yeah,
10.
It doesn't say 10 times per year, it says 10 times total. Now, who's tracking that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I say
Pull it up.
pull it out, that's what I think, I don't know what you
That-
guys.
That was my thought as well. It seems like it really, just from an enforcement standpoint, if nothing else, who's tracking those
yeah,
10 days?
so in that ideal, yes, I don't know how we're going to actually enforce that without it becoming unreasonable. So as long as we're all in agreement on that, and I believe we are, yes.
And
Let's just.
it
let's
sounds
probably
like
take
this one is less of a time-sensitive one, so you guys could certainly chew on it some more if you wanted
Right,
to.
but I think that in particular can be taken out.
Yeah, yeah, it sounds like that's, and I agree. I didn't totally understand what it was there for anyhow. Let's see if there's any other specific issues that, did you guys have any other concerns about the ordinance generally, or?
Not in particular, so.
I didn't go over this as carefully as, but
Okay.
just because time, but
Yeah, and again.
I'm
it's less-
sure if it's okay, you know.
Well, it's
and
less
what-
time sensitive, and a lot of it is discretionary, so if you want to take, we can lay it over to the next meeting, you guys would take some time to chew on it, see what you think, talk to your constituents and see if they've got any concerns. I don't know to what extent, I know you were contacted by somebody who wanted to buy a property specifically for purposes of running an Airbnb essentially in the city, and I think that the answer to it was that at this point, it's not totally clear that the definition in the zoning code, applying, I think the tourist rooming house or
Yeah.
something is in the code.
Yeah.
It's not totally clear that that's intended to be the same thing as an Airbnb, but to the extent it is, right now they're prohibited, which would be in conflict with the state law. So there's this gray area in terms of whether a tourist rooming house could be, I mean, they used to actually have boarding houses, right, where somebody would like rent out a room, and it was not really an Airbnb, it was almost like a permanent bed and breakfast type scenario,
Yeah.
where you'd rent out a room in somebody's house, and you would be like maybe you would get meals and whatnot, but that was your permanent residence.
Yeah, is that okay? Now, okay, so I have a case, and it almost occurred. A friend's daughter wanted to stay in my basement, you know, put her own bed and stuff, while she's finishing a semester at college because of roommate problems and stuff. Now, it turned out where it wasn't needed, okay? But I was going to do that. Is that, and I'm not going to collect any rent from her.
Right.
So is that the determining factor, I guess?
That's part of it. If there's no rent collection, then you're just taking some. At some point, it can get a little bit gray, because single-family dwelling is supposed to be for a single-family unit. But even that gets a little bit complicated, because there's some case law that, questions I'm not sure to what extent that's ultimately enforceable.
Right, because I have had a couple of complaints over the years. How many people are living in their house?
Yep,
You know, is that allowed?
yep.
Right?
Do we have it? I don't know.
Well, and nowadays, multi-generational dwellings are becoming more popular again, so you have your mother-in-law suites and those
Yep.
type of things. So as you have an aging population, people can't take care of themselves, rather than involving assisted living or nursing homes, you bring mom and dad in-house, and now it's a multi-generational house. It's still the same family, but it's not necessarily the traditional single-family dwelling anymore.
And does it matter how many, the space and the people? Only, 10 people in this
Yeah,
home per square feet?
There generally is no restriction now. I have multiple neighbors where their family style is there's 10 to 15 people living in a single-family home, which that normally wouldn't be able to contain that
Okay,
many
so
people, but they
it's,
do it.
so we don't have any, okay.
But at some point, there can
Inherently.
be public health issues depending on how many people are packed in and whatnot. I don't
And
know.
that's what the complaint was to me. This isn't healthy for so many but,
And I don't know, that'd be a good question for a code enforcement person. I'm not sure where that line lies, or the health department for that matter.
right. Okay, yeah. Well, I'm probably fine with it
Yeah,
as written,
other
but
than that, I
if you
just,
want to.
we can move to recommend to common council, at the minimum, have it circulated with the rest of the alderpersons and have the mayor review it as well, and then we'll take it up as needed.
Okay.
Sound good?
All right. Make that change, then you want to make a motion to recommend that?
Yep, so I will make a motion to recommend ordinances stated, aside from the minor changes that Chris needs to make for Airbnb and VRBO regulations, to bring to the mayor and common council for approval.
I'll second.
All in favor?
I mean, so are we
Good.
approving it?
Discussion.
Yeah, recommending. You're
Oh, we're-
recommending.
We're bringing the
Yeah.
recommend
Yeah.
forward so that we can actually get it
Right.
to.
Yeah, everything we do at this level is just a recommendation to
Right,
common
that's,
council ultimately anyhow.
yeah, okay.
Second by Alderperson Bailey. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. All right, and lastly, an update on the alcohol licensing ordinances. And
Yeah, so
last-
this is another one that's a little bit interesting. So, my understanding from the prior conversations with the common council were that the kind of three issues that Greenfield would like to get a handle on is just, one is just the general number, and the concern that alcohol licensing generally is kind of proliferating. Like every business is gonna start applying for a liquor license. In the sense that that's not good for the community, it's not good for
Yeah.
neighbors, it's not good for kind of the neighboring businesses. So the goal was to try to get a handle on the overall number. There was also a sense that the types of businesses, not only the number of businesses, but the types, so things that weren't traditionally in the business of selling alcohol were now asking for alcohol licenses so they can do that as well. So we wanted to kind of rein that in. And then the third thing was a concern about gas stations and restaurants potentially
Yep.
mixing and getting Class B licenses for restaurants that are in gas stations.
Yep.
So the ordinance I put together now kind of attempts to address some of these issues. I don't, as I indicated in the email, I certainly don't think this is ready for necessarily recommendation to the board, the common council, although I guess it could be depending on what the committee wants to do. But on the number issue, there's kind of two different options on that. One would be to differentiate based on the class of license, and one would be to differentiate based on kind of the size of the retailer. So the class of license, we're dealing with all Class A licenses. So Class A are the away licenses. So you've got three types, basically. You've got a Class A liquor license, which is picking up actual liquor, but the way the statute's defined, it also effectively picks up beer. There's a Class A just beer license, so you can get that, so you can only sell beer, but you can't sell liquor.
Yep.
Or a Class A cider license, so you can just sell cider. If you get the beer license, you also get the cider, essentially. So those are the license categories that we're looking at. We could just put individual quotas on each of those categories and say we don't want to, the city won't issue more than X number of licenses. So I put in the ordinance is what you currently have out there already. So there's currently 9 Class A fermented malt beverage licenses, so those are licenses just to sell beer. There are 5 Class A cider licenses. Those are actually issued to 5 of the same 9 establishments that are selling beer, essentially. And then the city has 17 Class A liquor licenses, so those are
Okay.
packaged
I know
sales.
this is a stupid question. So cider
Cider, yep.
is different than beer? How? By the alcohol content?
Just by definition, really, just by definition. I mean, it's a different manufacturing process. Cider
I
is from a
see.
fruit.
Okay.
So it's statutorily,
Okay.
it's defined differently. Practically,
Yes.
probably really isn't much of a difference, which is why those two tend to go hand in hand. Even the retailers that don't sell liquor usually will sell beer and cider. And frankly, until a couple of years ago, cider wasn't really a thing that people bought. It's become pretty popular in the last couple of years.
I see.
So I think that's kind of where it came into the picture.
Thank you.
And I think
So-
there actually are some cideries in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
So I think that part of the reason it's regulated now too. So that's one option. The other way, I kind of looked at it, I worked with Jennifer to try to get an inventory of sort of what the size of the retailers you currently have are. And generally, I broke it down by just large retailers and small retailers. And 10,000 square feet is the number that I picked. I don't know if that's a solid number to use for a dividing line between a large retailer and a small retailer. We can look at that maybe and see if there's another number that makes sense. I think some of your Walgreens are relatively small. So I'm not sure if that's a real number or not. But we could theoretically, and I say theoretically because I've never seen this done before, so you're kind of getting a little bit out there in terms of experimental areas, but you could theoretically put a quota based on the size of the retailer on the theory that the Common Council thinks it's appropriate to have a lot of different options.
Yep.
Even while we're trying to cap it, we want to make sure that no type of business necessarily gets an unfair advantage. So we're going to kind of separate it out by types of business.
Right.
Again, I've never seen an ordinance that does it this way, so anytime you're doing something novel, you're maybe a little bit more likely to be challenged. But theoretically, this is because it's a legislative functioning, it's a legislative decision. A reviewing court should be very deferential to the city and say, look, as long as we looked at it and there's a solid basis for it, we can give some good reasons why we went with the structure that we went with. That's something that should be upheld. But the reality is that anytime you start getting into liquor licensing, there's obviously a large financial incentive for people to be able to get the licenses. So it's not unheard of that you would be challenged and you may end up having to fight. And again, if a judge could look at this and say, boy, large retailer, small retailer, I'm not sure what the distinction is, why is
You
that?
don't want to be challenged.
Yeah. So I think from a defensibility standpoint, just keeping a simple quota is the safest course of action. And I think it could be a quota based on the type of Class A license. Typically it's not necessarily done that way. It's just a quota on, usually the liquor license is the one that people are primarily concerned about, less so the beer and the cider. So I think if you guys wanted to, we could just put a quota on the Class A liquor licenses and not the other ones. But again, from prior conversations, it sounds like the concern is that these things proliferating generally.
Yeah.
So it makes sense to do a quota on liquor and beer and cider, if that's what you guys ultimately want to do. I guess the last thing I would say is that obviously we can't be, if we're worried about getting sued, we certainly don't want to take away the licenses from any operating businesses already.
Correct.
So at the very least, the quota's got to be whatever we're currently at, so that people can come in and keep renewing their licenses, so they can keep their doors open.
Yep.
So it really then just becomes a question of how many additional licenses above what's already out there does the Common Council think would be appropriate, if any?
I think at the end of the day, for me, provided we can come up with something, I still want to look at that hybrid approach where it's quota and based on type, so that we don't unnecessarily create restrictions. Because if we go the straight quota route, we're inherently going to box someone or something out at some point that may be detrimental.
And that's, at some point, that's gonna happen regardless. I mean, once you put a
Right,
number on
at
it,
some
there's-
point, yes, there's
There's
still
gonna be
going
somebody
to
who
be.
wants something, and you just have to say no. From an administrative standpoint, it's, on our level, it's much nicer and say, look, the number is what it is,
Yeah.
we're at our cap, we're done.
Yeah.
But it politically can be a little bit tough if there's a business that the Common Council would really like to see be able to locate in Greenfield, and now we're out of licenses. The code can always be changed, but it starts to look like you're really tailoring
Yeah, that
things
you're
just to-
giving away just for somebody
Right.
else, which is
So
why
that's a
I'm
problem.
afraid
That's a
of
problem.
just
So, right.
doing a straight quota.
Right.
But I am
Exactly. 'cause
one
that-
person of this board, so I'm more than
Exactly.
happy to listen to
The
everyone else's
state-
opinions.
The state has a
Yep,
quota.
the state's got a quota on the Class B side. So that's the liquor, Class B is like your bar license. So that's like your consumption on the premises, in-house. There's a Class B quota that every community has. And then there's a certain number of reserved Class B licenses above that cost $10,000 up front. So Greenfield's already maxed out. You've already hit your quota on your Class B license. And I think there's a couple of reserved Class B licenses that are available, or maybe just one. But that's controlled by state statute. There's not a whole lot you can do there. They've actually loosened things up a little bit that allow communities to kind of get licenses from each other. So if there's another community that has a license that's not using it, and you wanted to find somebody, there's ways that that can happen. There's also certain exceptions to the quota at the state level. Restaurants over 300 seat capacity is one of them. I think opera houses, things that are very sort of niche. It's really intended to kind of pick up, basically to cap the number of true bars, essentially is what's, bars and restaurants that are under 300 capacity.
Yeah, so shorten this, it's, can we come up with a hybrid approach that makes sense, that doesn't unnecessarily restrict Gina's capacity to actually formalize and do and implement the city planner role in regards to this? Can we do it or not? Based upon the draft that's been presented not only to us, but to the mayor and else for the time being.
Well, that's part of the reason I put the.
And if we can, do we need to have, I don't even know if we can, well, it's probably all of us, it wouldn't be an internal meeting, it's just to say, can we come up with definitions for what that would be on the hybrid approach and then bring it back to.
And there's different ways to do it. I mean, if you want to go down that road, I thought the square footage was a relatively easy way to implement it. An applicant would come in, you look how big it was. If it's over 10,000 feet, then you're under this quota. If you're under 10,000 feet, you're under this quota. We could theoretically try to define different types of businesses. Liquor stores, which right now anyhow are not in your zoning codes. There won't be any new liquor stores. That can change. But you could try to define it based on liquor store. I toyed with different definitions, trying to define grocery stores. There's different, we could try to tackle that, or we could tie it back to your zoning code, all that's in the process of being changed, I think, as well. So it gets a little bit more complicated when you have businesses that don't really fall cleanly into any of those categories. Then it becomes, from an interpretive standpoint and administrative standpoint, that becomes much more complicated. Try to figure out, okay, is this a convenience store? Is it a gas station? Is it a grocery store? Is it a liquor store? What is it?
Right, so in that regard then, could you and Gina put together what you think would be the best possible solution? Let's say if it's just based on square footage, before we try to go any further
Yeah,
than
we
that.
can kind of do a survey.
Does this make sense? And then bring that to present back to us, which we can then recommend forward as necessary.
Yeah, we can look, I think we can do kind of an inventory of what you
I don't want to go I don't want to go any further than that unless we feel it's absolutely necessary, taking away from Gina's time.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good.
Just to start, before
And
we
again,
try to get too novel.
Well, that's it. In practice, whatever number we pick is going to be arbitrary in one sense, right?
Yeah.
But we need a dividing line to try to define larger retailers or smaller retailers.
Yep.
And we can look at what's currently out there. The other two provisions in here are the grocery store and the gas station limitation. On the grocery store one, the language I came up with basically, in an effort to try to define what a grocery store is, I suppose, basically I put language in here saying that the business has to, for all new licenses, so basically, again, we're carving out existing licenses for true liquor stores, convenience stores, pretty much everything that's licensed now. But any new license would only be issued to a business that is devoting more retail floor space to the sale of groceries than it is to the sale of liquor. So that gets, it means that you gotta be selling groceries, so you can't just you couldn't do, say, a Kohl's store getting a liquor license, because they don't sell groceries, they sell clothing, they sell everything else, they couldn't get a liquor license.
Yep.
But I think it would still be broad enough to pick up like your superstores, like your Walmart superstores, your Target superstores, or Meijer, where they have like a full grocery store, but also kind of a full department store, right?
Yep.
But as long as more floor space within that store was devoted to groceries than to alcohol, they would fall within the definition, they could get the license.
Okay.
So that's kind of how I tried to run through that, and I think that would be relatively easy to implement. We'd have to look at it. The Quick Mart, we kind of already had to kind of go down that road, right?
Yeah.
We looked at how much space they had devoted to alcohol sales compared to what their other, so.
Okay.
That's pretty easy to administer.
That's
as
kind of what I
well,
was thinking.
To have them calculate square footage of retail space.
And then the gas station one, I mean, right now, the verbiage in here basically just says that no Class B liquor license or Class B beer license, so basically a service license, would be issued to any restaurant that's on the same parcel as a filling station or gas station.
Okay.
Or parcel that somebody's applying for a filling gas station. So it's gotta be under separate ownership, and it's gotta be physically separated within the building.
Okay.
So I think that would accomplish it. It's a little complicated, because I know there are, and it's more of a policy consideration, I guess, for the committee and ultimately the common council. But there are some larger, it seems like it's a new thing, but it's a large format gas station slash
Truck stop slash
truck
house,
stops,
but for
like
that
a
to,
Buc-ee's or these things are,
Yeah.
I don't think there's
Just
any.
pretty
not that I would want to say Buc-ee's, you can't come to Greenfield
Right,
as an example.
right. And then I think those.
Buc-ee's is great, by the way.
Well, and that's it, people love them, but it's kind of,
So-
it's kind of a restaurant inside of a gas station, so this could carve that out. This could prevent that business from being able to locate in the city, so is that something, is that?
Do
really
we have
what
a
you guys wanna
space
do?
for someone to actually start a business like that?
Well, that's the
to
thing, is
begin
that
at the
they
start?
do require a lot of space, so I don't know if that's something that's likely or not, but, it does seem like it's a more popular business model than it was a few years ago.
Right.
And even Racine, where I live in Mount Pleasant, there's a gas station, The Dish, yeah. It's a gas station and it's got a
Oh,
restaurant.
I should know better, because.
It's not a super fancy restaurant, but it's a
not.
restaurant and it's,
Don't disparage the.
it's not a bad, I've been there a few times, it's not bad. And I think they have a liquor license. I know, in fact, I know they have Bloody Marys, so
Yeah.
it's,
They better.
The Dish
Yeah,
has,
it's a-
I know, they're a
it's becoming a
bakery restaurant, yes, I remember that.
yeah, it's
Very
becoming a
well.
more common type of thing, so,
But they are physically separated there from the gas station. The Dish is, the physical building is, and I know that, because I went there. I
trying to
used to
think
eat there almost every other day for lunch. and
yeah. So I think there is a separate door, yeah, I suppose interior is
It's,
separate.
the gas station is completely separate from that building.
And is it a different owner?
I don't know if
You
they
know,
remember, though.
see,
Yes
that
and
was-
no, because OH Danish Bakery used to own the building, and then they said someone else bought it to run the
Okay.
restaurant.
We'll
But the gas station is
We'll
supposed to be, yeah,
Yeah.
it's supposed to be, we ask, our,
so, and,
I
you
know
know,
who to call to ask,
Right.
right, in Oak Creek, so.
I have a question about, a different owner. Is that okay to say? That, I don't know.
They just open up their own LLC and just.
Well, and there's ways around it. I mean, you can set up a different, it's a limitation that maybe seems more restrictive than it really is. Because this just has a different ownership, so we could set up a different LLC. If we really wanted to kind of drill down into it, we could try to get it ownership of the LLCs to try to make sure it's a separate.
Just wait till they use the Delaware Convention, but.
Yeah, so I don't know that in practice it's that big of a limitation, because usually you set up a different LLC to run each business anyhow, just from liability standpoint
Yep.
and whatnot, there's benefits to doing that. So in that sense, maybe it doesn't even make sense to put the restriction in there, maybe it's just more we just keep the physical separation. Because I think the concern primarily is just making sure that people aren't drinking while
Right.
they're getting gas.
Correct.
And then driving away, right?
Yep.
Was your intention for physically separated, meaning wall within the same structure, or two, more like the Dish where they're separate buildings?
I don't know.
If it functionally becomes a way and it doesn't become restrictive, but then inherently we are telling the current property owners that may or may not want to accomplish this, that you need to build a separate building on their lot, and if they do it, now they have Coy Gras to do whatever they want.
Yeah.
And
Because-
was that the intention to begin with? The Dish, I would say, is a special case in Oak Creek, and they have their own little ditty going on there, and they don't cause problems, but that doesn't mean someone else can't.
Right. And the one in Racine, I think it does share a wall technically with the gas station, but I don't think it's accessible internally.
Yeah, maybe that's the defining,
Yeah.
the internally accessible.
So even if it's all one building, as long as there's a hard barrier between
Yeah.
the restaurant portion and the gas station portion.
Because I was recently asked, a gas station owner, what? He says, well, I can put a wall here. I can put a wall in between.
No,
I don't know, is that what we
The
want?
guy on Loomis Road, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he wanted to do something like that,
Did he ask you to?
yeah.
See,
I
so,
told him, yeah, it doesn't.
inherently,
So-
the gas
and I-
station,
Good idea.
Yeah.
any of them on Loomis, it's not just the one, right? They could
Right.
all attempt to do that
the
if
one,
they
not,
really wanted
not
to.
Loomis
Right.
and Layton, further down.
Oh,
So-
no, this guy was on Loomis and Layton.
Oh, this is another one on Loomis.
Regardless of where they all could attempt to do something
Right.
like this, so,
And so the concern is the drinking and driving portion of it, obviously.
right.
I know there's also been some concern, we have to maybe finesse this a little bit because the statute is frankly kind of stupid, but dealing with the gambling machines, and
Yeah,
they're still,
that, on top of that, yeah.
right, they're still, gambling machines are still illegal, but they're less illegal if you have a Class B license. And the statute basically
know.
really
This is the
really curtails municipalities'
craziest.
ability to enforce those restrictions.
Yep.
So that's why we have to be careful that we're not kind of trying to enforce this indirectly through our liquor licensing scheme, because the state may not approve of that.
Yep.
So it's an interesting issue. But I do think maybe that is a good, maybe the ownership piece is less important than maintaining a permanent physical separation between the restaurant portion and the gas station portion.
I would say let's start with that for
Okay.
now,
I can
aside
put some
from,
language and bring that back. and
right,
see what we
putting,
think.
putting together that table, if you will, of your suggestions for square footage for quota basis on a hybridized schedule for the time being. Anything else from the both of you, other than what we just talked about, that you think should be revised or adjusted for review?
I'm trying to figure this out, okay? I'm having a difficult time. We don't want, if we don't want liquor sales at a gas station, what is the difference if we just build a wall and then we say that's okay?
Well, it's service, so a couple things. So right now, you already don't allow actual liquor sales at gas stations. That's already prohibited in here. You do allow beer, though. But what we're talking about now is actually service of alcohol at the same building that houses the gas station. So right now, you're allowed to buy beer and cider and whatnot at a gas station and take it away. What's on the table now is saying, because people are starting to ask for them, frankly, no, we're not going to give you a license that would allow you to actually serve alcohol at a gas station unless there's a physical wall.
Yeah,
So-
but what's the difference? I mean, and I'm thinking of this. So if they build a wall, then they can serve alcohol or whatever, you know, they want to.
I mean, the concern is that,
We don't want a straight bar operating next to the gas station, whether it's a
Right.
conjoined wall or it's a separate building.
because you could theoretically, someone could theoretically put a bar in there, that would be a beer bar, but put a
Yeah.
bar where you could pull a
Yeah.
pint and have a pint while you're waiting after you fill
Yeah,
your tank. and
but
then-
we're saying if you build a wall separating it, it's okay? What's the
Right, I mean,
difference?
they could easily just walk around the corner and do the same thing. I mean, it's a good point. But I think from a,
You're not wrong, Shirley.
Yeah.
In fact, it's not,
Well, I-
this is why this is
yeah, this is where it gets complicated.
functionally, if they're, you'd be unnecessarily restricting a business or property owner if you told them they'd have to physically put up a separate building just to do it in the first place. Now, whether or not we find legal means to say that
And I
that
think
can
what
be
would,
defined.
and again, it gets back to the gaming, the video gaming or the gambling machine,
Yeah.
which are technically not gambling machines either, they're whatever,
Yeah.
we all know what they are.
Yeah.
What's driving this to a certain extent is that the restaurant or the gas stations want those because they're a revenue source.
Yep.
Not so much your corner gas stations, more so for gas stations that cater more so to like over, maybe truck drivers, things along
Yep.
those lines, people who are spending more time in the gas station.
Yep.
But there is some competitive pressure because some of them do have them. Usually the ones right along the interstate do have the gaming machines. So the other gas stations want to have that as well, so that they're on the same playing field. So they're applying for the liquor license, not even necessarily intending to use it. They just want to have the liquor license on hand because it minimizes their exposure on the gaming machines. So that's why part of the reason we put the separation, the physical separation there is to try to force them, if they want to play this game, I guess for lack of a better term, okay, you actually have to build out a restaurant space then. You've got to have a separate wall, you've got to have, a restaurant, you've got to have tables, you've got to have a kitchen, you've got to have, we're not going to allow you to just pretend like you're a restaurant so you can get a license and then, bringing your gaming machines and minimize your exposure if there's ever an enforcement action. That's part of what the concern is here, and that's part of the cat and mouse game, I guess, that's kind of going on.
Is it going to continue, the cat and mouse game that he's referring to? Probably.
Yeah.
But if we have to start with this at minimum, and then with the intention that we'll probably have to
And
modify
I can
it.
look at, I can ask around and see if there's any other communities that have come up with a good way to try to tackle that issue. Because again, where it gets further complicated is the legislature, not only are they kind of ambivalent about whether these things ought to be illegal, they really kind of curtail the municipality's ability to enforce those rules independently. They're saying only we can enforce this stuff. So to the extent we're trying to curtail that, they may not, that may not be.
Allow it in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'll ask around and see if I can find any communities that have either, maybe they've just tackled it up front and they're just willing to run the risk, or if they've come with some other way to try to make sure that it's, maybe we flip it around, maybe that's the consideration here. We wanna, instead of focusing on the gas station portion, maybe we flip it around and focus more on the restaurant portion, say, it's gotta be a true restaurant. It's gotta have a physical wall, it's gotta have a kitchen, it's gotta have tables, it's gotta have, so that they couldn't just put up a wall
Yeah.
in their gas station and now, okay,
Yep.
that's the restaurant. Maybe that's the way we can try to tackle it, because that's as much of the concern as
Yeah,
anything
as
else,
a
right?
revision to draft, that
Yeah.
would be a good start.
Yeah.
So
okay.
outside of what we previously talked about with doing that hybridized schedule as an example in a draft, we can add that to the revision for the draft.
Okay.
Other than that, once that is done, circulate that with
Yep.
the
Yeah,
rest
so we
of
don't
the
need any
council.
recommendations on this one yet tonight.
Yep.
I'll take it back, I'll make some changes, we'll come with some numbers that we think are still workable. That's always part of this, I'm trying to,
Yep.
I'm always very cognizant of municipal staffs, because
Yep.
you guys have enough work to do, and you want to try to interpret things that could mean a different thing to
Yep.
different people, so.
Okay, outside of that, that will take care of that item. Other than that, I will call for a motion to adjourn at 7:01 PM.
Make a motion to adjourn.
I will second. All in favor for adjourn?
Aye.
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 Motion carries unanimously.
Okay.